Greetings from the set of Metro and More at Metropolitan Community College, serving more than 50,000 students with over 120 programs at our 8 locations in the daytime, evening, weekends, or online. And I'm your host, Kent Pavelka. Welcome again to Metro and more of what you need to know about Metropolitan Community College. We have a fascinating discussion in the hour ahead. We're going to be talking about the Dred Scott Heritage Foundation with Lynne M. Jackson. Lynne is the president and founder of the Dred Scott Heritage Foundation and also the great-great-granddaughter of Dred and Harriett Scott. Ms. Jackson was a presenter recently at the college in conjunction with Metropolitan Community College's Black Heritage Month programming. Treat to have you on the show and in Omaha for your appearance here at Metro. Good to have you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure already. I've only been here a day and a half, and I love it here.
Very good. You're from St. Louis area.
St. Louis,
yeah.
Missouri.
So we're not far apart.
No, not at all.
A lot of people think Omaha and St. Louis have a similar feel. I don't know about that, but I've heard that before.
Well, it's not a huge city. Neither of them are huge cities, but they're quiet. They're quiet.
Yeah. I've spent a little time in the St. Louis area. I enjoy it. For starters, just a fascinating family tree. Maybe you can explain a little bit about, maybe start with yourself, go back to your parents, your grandparents, and then your great-great-grandparents, the great-great-granddaughter of Dred and Harriett Scott. Take us back from you to way back then.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. I've never been asked to do it that way before, but it works either way.
Well, you can go either way.
Well, you know what I do? I usually tell people the easiest way to feel how this works is to realize that my grandfather was Dred Scott's grandson. And so it's a hop, skip, and a jump to go back. But actually, my father was Dred Scott's great-grandson. Mm-hmm. So it's paternal. And then his father was the grandson. And then the mother of my grandfather, which is very interesting because we had always been told growing up that it was Lizzie Scott. But it turns out to be Eliza Scott. So for many, many years, really up until 2006, we had the wrong lady for the great-grandmother.
For the great-grandmother, not the great-great-grandmother.
No, that would be Harriet.
Yeah.
Right. But they had 2 daughters, so it was the wrong daughter. But there was a reason for that. So the great-grandmother is Eliza Scott, and then she is one of 2 daughters of Dred and Harriett, her sister being Lizzie. So to bring it back the other way, you have Dred and Harriett, mm-hmm. You have Eliza, the oldest, and then Lizzie. Eliza married Wilson Madison, and we'd always been told Lizzie married Wilson Madison.
Gotcha.
But Eliza married him. And there were 2 surviving boys. Actually, we only thought there were 2 boys, Harry and John. But we found out in 2006 that she may have easily have had 4 other children, but they all died very young, mm-hmm. and their births and deaths are recorded. So we have that information. And then once Eliza's 2 boys grew up, one, Harry, we don't know what really happened to him. They say he died, and then some say he kind of went away. But John, the remaining son, is my grandfather. So he married Grace Madison. That was my delightful grandmother. They had 7 children. My father was the 6th of 7, John Alexander Madison. He was also the family historian. He went to Lincoln Law School, graduated from there, as well as Harris-Stowe State Teachers College. At the time it was college. And he was the family spokesperson. Everybody would say, oh, no, go to John. He knows all that stuff, And so I had no clue. I was going to really be following in his footsteps, but it did turn out that way.
Yes, it did, as the mm-hmm. president and founder of the foundation. Yeah. Lots of questions for you. So we just went from 1799 to 2014. Basically,
right.
In that
Pretty
conversation,
quick,
yeah. And all this information passed along and documented in the family?
Well,
somehow?
let's clarify that. All this information didn't get passed along. Some of it did. A lot of it was uncovered after 2006. And I think you can credit that to the internet, computers, our society, social media, things like that, because there was a core understanding, but finding out more about the babies that we didn't know that they had, all of this happened since 2006. Yeah. So, it was kind of like part 1 and part 2.
Tell us a little bit about the foundation. Well, first of all, you're from St. Louis, and I just want to get a couple things in about you personally. You are a graduate of, I'm trying to remember.
SIU Edwardsville.
SIU Edwardsville.
Business Administration and Marketing.
And you're an accomplished pianist?
Yes, yes, yes. Oh, can I brag a little bit about, not me, but my teacher? Because I really loved my piano teacher, Ladue Wells. And you know, it's one of those history stories that never gets told, you know, but I'm trying to tell it. I call her Juilliard in the Ville, okay? And the Ville was an area of St. Louis where blacks were affluent at one time, and you know, it's the inner city area. But she could sit down and just play anything. And so Rachmaninoff was my person, somebody else was another composer. She was fabulous. So Ladue Wells Piano Studio. And I know that's probably not a big deal to anybody, but if you knew her and if you knew the accomplished people that came out of her studio and the fact that it was just this little house in the ghetto, that it's amazing
what came out of that little house.
Yeah,
including you. You play still?
I do. I also play by ear. So when I don't have time to really, you know, keep up with a particular piece, I just play whatever I want, and that's kind of a nice gift.
Well, I just wanted to give the folks a feel for who you are. You do that, but you've had an interesting professional career.
I have.
And now you spend all your time with the foundation now?
Yeah, pretty much. I do. Yeah.
Share what you've done in your career.
Well, I started at the Girl Scout Council as a field executive and went on to be the business operations director of St. Louis Council, the biggest and the best. Hey, girls. And that was a wonderful, wonderful opportunity. I also have 2 children. I stayed home with them for a little while. I worked for a wonderful company in St. Louis. Most people would know it as Cass Bank, but Cass Logistics is one of their companies. I was data entry supervisor there. Then I had the privilege of working at Ford Motor Company in St. Louis. And then my last wonderful job was at Bryan Cave Law Firm in St. Louis, an amazing place. And that's when the anniversary came, and they were extremely supportive. So I have to always say thank you to them and how wonderful a relationship they've allowed us to continue over the years.
The anniversary.
150th anniversary of the Dred Scott Decision was on, well, March 6, 2007. Big day.
So when did you begin the foundation?
Well, actually, we started getting that together in late 2005, but it was official in 2006. But we were already working on the anniversary.
Because of the anniversary.
Right. And I felt that that was a good way to create an umbrella under which we brought in 40 and then 60 organizations who participated in a wonderful year-long commemoration of events that pointed to this historic event.
Yes.
And its implications.
Yeah, there are some interesting, your website has some fascinating, what's the address again?
www.DredscottFoundation.org.
Yeah, okay, there it is on screen, and you can see some interesting things that the foundation has been involved in. I mean, some fascinating pictures on there, the Penny Drive, the Sculpture Park, the theater troupe, all of that, and we'll talk about that.
Sure.
But, you know, there are, unfortunately, literally, a good percentage of our audience have no idea who Dred Scott is.
That's true.
So we want to get to that story as soon as you can kind of give us the mission of what are you trying to accomplish with the foundation?
Well, the foundation was founded on 3 pivotal vision points. One was commemoration. We knew the anniversary was coming, and we wanted to be a part of that, but we also knew that there was no statue of Dred Scott anywhere in the world, and that was a major goal coming in. Education, simply because people really don't know who this man and his wife were and what they accomplished, etc. And then reconciliation, which was quite the challenge, but it's like I felt like I got this download from on high that this is what you will do. And it has all worked together amazingly well. So commemoration, education, and reconciliation are our focal points.
Very good. Okay, the story of Dred and Harriett Scott. Maybe just start with a basic outline and who they were, what happened, and then we'll go from there.
Right, okay, yeah, this will be the broad overview. All right, Dred Scott was born in Virginia, Southampton, Virginia. He was owned by Peter Blow, a man who had a wife and 11 children, actually. He eventually decided to move his family westward till they ended up in St. Louis. In St. Louis, things got a little worse. His wife died. He had a daughter get married. His finances went down, and he eventually had to sell something to cure his debts. And one of those sales was Dred Scott, a slave that had been with him most likely from birth, and yet someone who had been an integral part of the family mix for many years. At the age, well, in 1830, one would guess he would have been about 30 years old.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we really don't know what year he was born in. He was sold to an Army surgeon, a Dr. John Emerson, and Dr. Emerson took Dred into free territory in Illinois and in Wisconsin. He met his wife, Harriet Robinson, in Wisconsin. They got married. They actually had a wedding with the Justice of the Peace, her owner, who gave her to Dred's owner so they could live as man and wife. And things happened there to the point that they came back to St. Louis. At this point, they had a daughter, and then Dr. Emerson dies.
Came back with the Emersons
Yes.
to St. Louis.
Right. Dr. Emerson passes away, and now the owner is Mrs. Emerson, Mrs. Irene Sanford Emerson, who they asked to buy their freedom from, or let us be free. She denied both of those. And then at some point, it was made clear to them that they had the option to sue for their freedom. And they did that on April 6, 1846 at the old courthouse. They went up and petitioned for their freedom. It took 5 years, 11 trials for them to go through the Missouri Supreme Court to the U.S. Supreme Court, through many attorneys and many long years, hiding their daughters away even for safety at some point, to hear the court say that they were not only not free, but they didn't have any right to be in court because they were not citizens. They also disavowed several laws, the Northwest Ordinance, the Missouri Compromise, that regulated slavery, and this just sent everything into a tailspin. They were told they were not free. The country just went ballistic over the rulings. The activist judges went beyond the scope of the trial, and therefore we had civil war. One interesting note, though, is that Abraham Lincoln was thinking much of getting out of politics until this decision, and then he decided he needed to stay in. And then we had the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, and on till we know what happened after that. But the outcome of all of that for the country was the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the 13th abolishing slavery, the 14th giving everyone born here citizenship, and the 15th the right to vote. And so that was a good outcome, but it came at a high price of the Civil War. In the meantime, Dred and Harriett did get their freedom on May 26th of 1857, which is about 7 weeks after the decision. And that's an interesting story, but ultimately
They got their freedom even though the decision was that they weren't free.
That's right.
Explain.
How did that happen? Well, it's a fun story, and it's what I call the rest of the story, part of the rest of the story. Mrs. Emerson had decided she didn't want to stay in St. Louis, and she wouldn't have anything to do with anything, but do send me your money. She put them, they had sued her, but they were now under the jurisdiction of the sheriff of St. Louis, and their monies were to be held in trust until it was determined whether they were free or not. She went out east to Boston. She found and married a Dr. Calvin Chaffee. He was a congressman and a very staunch abolitionist. She just kind of conveniently forgot to tell him that she owned these famous slaves. He found out, and it was all downhill for her after that. They never got divorced as far as we know, but he really suffered his reputation because people assumed that he knew and that he was being hypocritical about being an abolitionist, none of which was true. We have letters to show how he and Montgomery Blair, an attorney in D.C. who argued the case at the Supreme Court, and Roswell Field in St. Louis, who actually got this back into the federal level courts. The three of them put their heads together and came up with a plan that they would have Mrs. Emerson and her husband sell the family to Taylor Blow, one of the younger of the Blow families again. And that family helped them along those 11 years as much as they could. They're very supportive of helping them to try to get their freedom. And now one of the youngest of the children buys them for $1 with the express intent and purpose to free them, which he did by posting freedom bonds, a $1,000 bond for Harriet, $1,000 bond for Dred, and they got their freedom bonds on May 26, 1857.
And yet the law of the land is still that.
Well, the law of the land was that there would be, slavery from coast to coast if that had been ratified. But they were saying that those of African descent had no rights that white men were bound to respect, and that they were not citizens. And they went back to try to interpret what the Constitution meant, or what the Founding Fathers say it meant. And there's a lot of dispute as to whether that's what they say it meant, but they said that they never were intended to be among we the people. And so they used that as a foundational basis to say they were not citizens, and therefore they could not even sue in court.
Right.
So if you want to be very technical about it, they threw the case out. Then went on to rule about slavery territorially, and it was just a big mess. Big mess.
It's a great thumbnail.
Yeah. Thank you.
Let's go back then and kind of deal with Dred's life and Harriet's life. You said we don't know when he was born. We think 1799, around in there.
Somewhere between that and 1805.
And he was born into slavery. Do we know about his parents?
Well, interestingly enough, we had not known about his parents. But one of the nice things that's happened here lately is that I have been contacted by, guess who, another member of the Blow family who lives in Virginia, Mr. Jeff Hines. And Jeff contacted me, I think it was in 2010, and he said that they, meaning he and some friends with the Virginia Historical Society, had been researching to find out who Dred's parents were, and then trying to find out if Southampton was his actual birthplace. The reason they wanted to do that was because they feel like there are 5 key people who are very instrumental in that era civil rights. People like Frederick Douglass, Nat Turner, Harriet Beecher Stowe, people like that, who really brought us to the point of the Civil War. But Dred Scott was one of those 5. And so the other 4, they know their birthplace. They all have birthplace markers, and it's all nice. But they don't have a birthplace marker for Dred Scott, and he lives very near there. And that's what they wanted to do. That was the goal. Well, 4 years after researching everything they could, they came to the conclusion that it's like 99% sure that he was born there, that 1% with historians and academicians and archivists, genealogists, you have to be 100% about certain things.
That's being one of them?
Well,
birthplace?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, yes. However, 99% was really, really close. And with the evidence that they had amassed over 4 years, the fact that they pretty much have surmised that Dred's father's name would have been Solomon and his mother was Hannah. And how they did this was by going back through the Blow family records, where they had left slaves to their children and their children left slaves to their children. And the woman that Peter Blow married, Elizabeth Taylor Blow, her family also, they have her family tree. And as it turns out, Dred's parents really, if it's Hannah and Solomon, which they pretty much believe it is, that those 2 would have come from the wife's side of the family. So even though Peter's the father, the head of the household and all that, these were her inherited slaves. And there's even a possibility that he might have had 3 brothers, and their names are on a chart as well. So this is information that we'll be sharing in March for Dred Scott anniversary in St. Louis, going into a little more detail about how that happened. And he'll be here, he'll be there in St. Louis. So it was great. And in the meantime, with 99% certainty, they were able to put a highway marker up for the Blow family and Dred Scott in Southampton, and I got to go there for that occasion.
And this information might lead to eventually knowing who his parents were?
Well, that's who they believe they are.
Okay.
I mean, they've done, so far, exhausted all they have to work with, and they're saying that that's who his parents are most likely are.
What was his life like, maybe in segments, as a child? And first of all, he was known as Sam, right?
Well, yeah. Well, that's a crazy story. Every time I get into that or look at it some more, to me it's just more and more confusing. And I hate to say it, but I'm like, it's like throwing up a deck of cards here.
Where's our props?
Yeah, I know. Do you have some cards? That would show you how I feel about that. Everything from the fact that, yes, he was known as Sam, they said, okay. But somewhere in their travels, when they were coming to St. Louis, they stopped in Alabama, and they were in Florence, they were in Huntsville. Well, some people say he had a brother named Sam.
Oh.
And if I'm not mistaken, I think on the genealogy charts there is a Sam. So since there was a Sam and he died, and some people say Dred Scott is buried in Alabama, is it Sam? Was that his brother? And then did he take his brother's name? Did he change it to Dred Scott? I've heard that he what is this man's name? He was a General Scott? There was a General Scott. And they called him the Great General Scott. So Dred Scott supposedly couldn't pronounce great, and it came out Drake or Dred or something like that. And so he took the name from the general that he admired. Then there's 2 or 3 other versions of it. The thing is, Sam is somebody, I don't know who he is, but Dred Scott also could have been, because Elizabeth Taylor Blow, her family line, when you go back, there was an Etheldred, which looks like Etheldred, but it's pronounced Etheldred.
And there's a Dred in there.
And there's a Dred in there. And then there were many Scotts, last names were Scotts. And so did somehow that combination of Etheldred and Scott turn into Dred Scott? So you can see why I threw my hands up on that one.
Sure.
His name is Dred Scott. What's that?
So what was his life like so he was we think he was a baby or very young back in Virginia, right?
Yes, a child. Well, only thing we really know is what would be typical.
Yeah.
There's nothing verbatim that said he did this that day or he...
We don't know much about him then until...
Not that much.
Until when?
I would say 1818.
1818?
When they moved to Alabama, when the whole family and the slaves came westward. But, for instance, as he matured and grew, one thing we do know, he makes a comment in one of the newspapers that was printed about him when they got their freedom, that he was with, quote unquote, them boys I was raised with, them blow boys I was raised with. And so it sounds like he definitely was right there, maybe somewhere in the middle of all those kids. He may have been one to watch over the younger ones. It was indicated that he would play with them, keep them busy, watch over them, whatever needs they had. He took care of horses. And that's when coming westward, it was like if the horses needed tending to, that was one of his jobs. So, from being born to 1818 and then 1830, when they get to St. Louis, he was a stevedore on the riverfront, people who load and unload the steamboats. He was a porter, he was a cook. And slaves who were not down south picking cotton were more domestic, and so they were doing domestic jobs. They would do whatever they could do, whatever they were skilled to do within a city environment. And his wife was a laundress. She did laundry and taught the girls the same skill as her mother had taught her. So they would be hired out in the different jobs that they had. So as a child, don't know much more than what would be typically ascribed to any slave child.
But in 1830, he's in St. Louis working, and that's a different twist on slavery than most people think about.
Well, it is. That's really true. I think this whole story is a bit of a different twist because it's not the family that beat him, and there was all this drama and stuff. Although that's not to say that who knows that there weren't some bad days. And Mrs. Emerson allegedly beat them, but it's also true that a lot of slaves had to put a clause in their suit about being mistreated for it to be, justifiable cause to bring the suit. It was just something legal that the attorneys always kind of threw in there. But there is a possibility that might have happened.
But he's in St. Louis working outside the home, basically, and turning over his check. I mean, that was the form of slavery in Missouri.
Yeah.
If you weren't in an agrarian situation further down southeast.
Yeah, and another interesting thing is that a lot of slaves in St. Louis were free. They went to a church in St. Louis, and if you were sitting on the pew, Dred and Harriett were sitting here as slaves. These 3 people over here might have been free with their 2 kids, and they all mingled together. You would walk down the street and you would see a free man with his, goods and whatever.
And that kind of brings us to the crux of the Dred Scott decision and the whole legal thing. And that was the movement from St. Louis up to, was it Minnesota or Wisconsin or?
Well, the Army surgeon took him first to Illinois and then to Wisconsin, right? And what you're referring to, I'm sure now, is the law that said once free, always free.
Right.
Yeah.
And so these fellow parishioners in church on Sunday, for some reason, had how had they obtained their freedom at that point?
Oh, many different ways. I mean, some people were actually born to free parents. In the North, there were obviously more free people there. Some people bought their freedom. Some people were given their freedom when their owner died and it was in their will. And in some cases that was supposed to happen, but maybe the children of that person did not set them free. Those people also, some of them went to court to sue for that. The difference between Dred Scott suing and maybe some others is that his went to the Supreme Court and really had this major overall effect, because they said, we're going to keep going. When they saw an open window, they kept going. But in St. Louis, there are over 300 freedom suits that were found in our basement of a courthouse.
Before Dred Scott's?
Around that time, before him, and around that, yeah.
But
really.
they all kind of gave up.
No, some of them actually won their cases. Like I said, if your owner said, I'm going to free you, it's in my will, when I die, you get to go free, and then the kids don't free you, then you can take the kid to court, and then they would probably have won their cases. Everyone was different.
But Dred Scott's suit was based on once free, always free.
That's right, yes. And there were a few others like that. There was precedent for that, which is pretty important, because when the Missouri Supreme Court denied them their freedom, they broke with precedents, because, and it was known, and some of the justices were upset about it, because it's like, what? We've always done this. Why are we not doing this? And it was more or less because of the times that they were in, which they literally said times are not as they once were when we made these decisions. And yet,
meaning what?
Meaning that, we're going to stop letting all these slaves go free. We really need to slow this down a little bit, because, this could get out of hand, and pretty soon we won't have control over this situation. Everybody will be coming with some just grounds, because a lot of people probably could have gone and gotten their freedom who just didn't go.
So arbitrarily, what I'm hearing you say is that there was too much of this going on, so we need to slow it down.
Well, there was that, but it was also the fact that we had a new justice bench, if you will. There had been more anti-slavery justices, and there were only 3 in Missouri. And then there were 2 pro-slavery and 1 non. And when that turned over, see, Dred Scott's case took so long to get there. By the time he got there, the judges had turned over to be more pro-slavery.
Yes.
And so, yes, to look around and see what could happen to the nation, to the economy, to their personal livelihoods, etc. They said, oh, we need to slow this down. But there were some other political things going on in the backdrop as well.
Well, go back and explain the once free, always free, and the issue of moving with the Emersons from St. Louis up north, where, and then when you return, that's when once free, always free should have come into play, right?
Right.
That was the whole point.
Right, exactly. Well, that's it. He lived for a while in Illinois. They met and married and lived for a while in Wisconsin. They went down to Louisiana for a little while. They went back to Wisconsin.
With the Emersons all along? Mm-hmm.
Yes, and then when he met Mrs. Emerson in Louisiana and married her, then he got shipped off to the war, to another little war, and left Dred and Harriett up in Minnesota. They all eventually got back. They even went to Iowa for a while. And he bought some land there. I don't think they stayed, but he went to Iowa and bought land. So Dred actually has traveled quite a bit. He was quite the traveled slave, if you will. And I think he picked up a lot of knowledge along the way. And there's references to that in some of the
forgive me for interrupting, but you're in Minnesota, you're in Wisconsin, you're in free territory. Why then are you not free up there?
Well, see, technically they were, but they didn't claim their freedom while they were there, okay? And that's the question. Sometimes people will say, well, why didn't you just leave? Well, you don't just leave. But he, I think, had the issue of having a wife and a child and not wanting to be caught in a Minnesota winter. Hello, friends up there.
Well,
Okay,
we're here.
no dogs and all of that. I mean, he was protective of his family, and
Fear.
and
Some
so
fear.
yeah, right. You know, we get stuck out there, we're done for. And no matter how quote unquote decent, I don't want to say good, you might have it in a situation, it can always flip on its head when you do something like that. So whereas they had a situation, and Dr. Emerson allegedly once, it's recorded that he got into a fight with another officer trying to get a heater for them, and didn't go well for, I don't think they got the heater, but he went to bat for them. And yet if he had tried to leave, maybe that relationship would have changed radically.
So he looked out for him
He
in some
did,
ways.
yeah. And at the same time, I think there was a possibility of another opportunity for him to get his freedom if he just waited a little bit. But that didn't happen either, and he came back to St. Louis, and now they really are not technically free anymore. And even Dred said, how is it that a man can step his foot in one place and be a slave and then just step over here and be free? It didn't make sense to him, but that's the way the laws were.
Yeah. So I don't know where to go with this. I mean, I've got so many questions for you here. What precipitated then the suit? I know he had help.
Well, the fact that Mr. Emerson died, or Dr. Emerson died, and his wife, Mrs. Emerson, really didn't seem to have much interest in them as people or anything other than what money they were bringing in. And now that she's a widow with a little girl, Henrietta, she's more interested in going to find, another life. And her sister lived out east. She went to visit her sister and probably to find another husband, and she found one. So she had left them here in the custody of the sheriff because the suits were still ongoing. She left, but that didn't mean it was over. It just meant I'm not sticking around here. Find jobs, and the sheriff will hold on to the money, and when this is all over with, and whoever won the case would get the money. But
But his suit had not been filed yet, right?
Dred?
Yeah, at that point in time.
Yeah, actually it had.
It had.
Because the first two cases were in St. Louis, and she didn't leave immediately. So yeah, let me say this, we didn't talk about. The first case was a mistrial because of hearsay. They didn't have the right witness on the stand, so somebody said somebody saw or knew something. That doesn't work. The second trial, they literally won the case. 12 white men on a jury looked at the evidence and said, yep, they should be free. And that was great, except she appealed it. And when she appealed the case, then that's when it kind of got weird. And she decided at some point she was going to leave, but her brother, John Sanford, was her backup, because when her husband died, their father died, and her brother kind of took over the affairs. It was never really clear whether or not she sold them to her brother or gave them to her brother or whatever, but the case was, and even Dred said, I don't really know who owns me right now. But the case came down as Dred Scott versus John B. Sanford. And
Well, what I was asking is, what was the motivation and what happened to precipitate the initial lawsuit in Missouri?
Oh, just the mere fact that the doctor had died, and they realized that they had the opportunity to be free. Now, one of the things that I speculate, we all speculate, is they went to a church, which was the Second African Church at the time. Today, it's still an active church. It's called Central Baptist Church in St. Louis. And at the time, a Reverend John Anderson was the pastor. He had worked with Elijah P. Lovejoy, who owned a newspaper and printing press. He was run out of town in St. Louis and went to Alton. And he printed over there and spoke against slavery in Alton, Illinois. But unfortunately, there were people there that didn't like it, even though Illinois was a free state. Not everybody agreed with that, and he was hunted down, murdered. His printing press was thrown in the river, his home burned, and they got rid of him. Reverend Anderson came back over to Missouri, and he was very much aware of the rights and the issues surrounding, freedom and all that. So it's a possibility that he told Dred and Harriett, or I want to say educated them a little more about what their options were. So again, I first think and say that they asked for their freedom because they had been in free territory. Then they offered to buy their freedom and give her $300, and she turned that down. And now that they've exhausted those two more simple options, the third one that was left was to go to court and claim the legal status that they had been free and they should be free.
What was the atmosphere like in the community after the decision in St. Louis?
Well, probably the same as everywhere else. Pretty not happy, not good. The decision was a blow, to everyone who valued freedom, but not just against the Scotts. People who had been free and who considered themselves citizens were now being told they weren't citizens. They didn't take away their freedom, but they took away their status. And they said they have no rights that anyone was bound to respect, and they couldn't do this, they couldn't. It was horrendous, and it wasn't just in St. Louis. This was nationwide, and that was one of the things. That's why it's a major catalyst, because, first of all,
didn't take freedom away, but
those who had it, no, but it totally diminished their status, And
what year was this again? This particular?
The Dred Scott decision.
No, the St. Louis decision.
Well, St. Louis started on April 6, 1846, but then it went on until the Missouri Supreme Court actually finally said their piece in March of 1852. So that was 6 years right there. Now, we have to talk about this wonderful gentleman, because I don't want to have this whole time go by without mentioning another hero of the story, and that would be Roswell Field. You know Roswell?
Well, I've done some research, but that's a new name for me.
Is it? Okay, well, wonderful. All right, well, Roswell Field was an attorney in St. Louis. Now, those of us who are over, I'll say 40, not to give my age away, but those of us over 40 would probably remember the name Eugene Field, the poet. Okay?
I'm over 40.
Yes, me too. So Eugene Field was a well-known poet, and he lived in St. Louis on Broadway, just blocks from the old courthouse. And his father was an attorney. His father was Roswell Field. The Field House is still there today. It's a National Historic Landmark, and primarily because of the role that Roswell played in the Dred Scott decision. As an attorney, he had hired Dred sometime to come up and clean his offices. So he got to know him. He knew about his case, of course. He knew about his case. And when it came down in Missouri that it was over, well, what's a slave to do? I mean,
in 52?
Yeah. It's amazing they got that far, and yet nothing good came of it. But Roswell Field wasn't happy. He wasn't pleased with that. And he's found another way. He found another way to bring that case back on the dockets, but in the federal courts. And he did that because, as I said a minute ago, Mrs. Emerson was gone, and now she had kind of turned her affairs over to her brother. Well, her brother didn't live in St. Louis. He lived in New York. And so if you have a case between two people in different cities or states actually, then you have a federal case. And that's a whole nother ballgame.
And that's one of the nuances in terms of how it got to the Supreme Court.
Exactly. It's exactly how it is. And that's what Mr. Field probably had in mind at some point, because he figured, well, if we don't win, it will go to the Supreme Court, and then we'll see. Well, they didn't win the next case. But Dred is now appealing, you see, because he's suing, and his verdict was not for him at this next level, and so it went to the U.S. Supreme Court. And Roswell Field was really extremely instrumental in all of this coming about, because had he not found the diversity clause, some call it, where you can sue a person from another state, take it to a federal level, then nothing would have happened, and they would have remained slaves. But fortunately, that didn't happen. So once it all came about, they didn't win at that level, but they took it as far as they could go.
And so another 5 years goes by, 52 to 57, and now we get the Supreme Court ruling, which basically backs up what everybody in Missouri said.
Right. Yeah. They upheld the lower courts, as it were. Yes.
At this point in time, your great-great-grandfather, it's 1857, he lives one more year, right?
Well, I like to be very clear about that. And it's kind of a little pet peeve of mine. He lives a year and a half.
Year and a half.
Yeah, because.
Well, excuse me.
Well, you're excused. Because, and I have a good reason for this, I really do. The poor man went all those years trying to get his freedom, and I think we should give him every day that he had left, you know.
But he died, well, so he got his freedom.
Well, yes, he did. He did.
Even though the Supreme Court upheld the Missouri rulings.
That's right. That's right. Taylor Blow. Taylor Blow. Okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you know, forgive me, but I
So
was...
he enjoyed it. He enjoyed his freedom, but he didn't win the case, and that had to be very disappointing.
Well, it was disappointing on one hand. I mean, I think after 11 years, maybe they just were, you know, ready to go with whatever worked out. I mean, you know, it beats you down. It really does. But the abolitionist husband, we talked about that. He's the one that made sure that they got their freedom, because he didn't know that I think had he known, it probably would not have got to that. To me, it's all very providential, you know, because this really is what broke the back of slavery. And ultimately, there had to be a civil war.
Yeah.
And if you ever go out and research the quotes, the magnificent quotes that people have written and spoken about these times, right after the Dred Scott decision, all these newspaper accounts are out there. And the things that people said and wrote are just fascinating. The North and the South, the different perspectives. But many people prophesied that the war would come. Even Frederick Douglass, when the decision was rendered, he said, well, okay, that's a good thing, because now we got to fight about it.
Yeah.
And he said, and something's going to happen.
Because
you know?
all these years,
Yeah.
this just was a festering under
That's true.
under the
Boiling.
radar reality, and now
Yeah, it's just out in the open, you know. So, so anyway, I know we're kind of moving all around in different places, but it's a great story. But the truth of the matter is, though, he lived a year and a half. He died on September 17th, and some places you'll Google and it'll say 9 months, and that one just irks me because he lived 17 months, and I just.
What was his
have
life
every day.
like the last year and a half? Was he ill?
The last year and a half, well, let's start with after the decision and after. He was famous. He was technically the most famous slave in the country. He took it with a grain of salt and quite a bit of humility. He was a porter for the Barnum Hotel in St. Louis.
At that time?
He was hired as a porter to be there, and he was the doorman. And so people would come to that hotel just to see him and shake his hand and meet him or talk to him. And he found that humorous, that this simple man would be so famous and people would come all the way here to see me. He had been offered a lot of money to travel and tell his story, but he probably didn't really care to do that, but his wife Harriet definitely did not want him to do that. And so he never did do that. But his last years were one of notoriety, but probably still cautious because things were brewing. You had John Brown out there on the rampage and all these factions at odds, Harper's Ferry. Things were coming on the horizon that were not good. And really the family kind of kept a low profile after that, about being the family that was part of the reason for the war. But,
so and then he died a year and a half after he had got his freedom?
Well, he did get tuberculosis.
He did.
And he died of that, yeah.
Why did, you've probably already answered this, but why, if Blow gives him his freedom after the Supreme Court ruling, why didn't he do it earlier?
Well, first of all, you didn't own him. Okay, think about it. Taylor Blow was one of those Blow members' children who married well, quote unquote, meaning that they were educated, they ran businesses, a few were attorneys, the girls and the guys, they married well, and they supported Dred, and they tried to get attorneys or pay bills when they could, solicit help where they could, but they didn't own him. Mrs. Emerson
owned him. Oh, that's right, that's
him.
the Emerson's, yep.
Right.
Okay.
And so back to the plan, which was that they had to figure a way to get him free. Well, you had to live in the same state that your slave was in order to free them. And the Chafees didn't live in St. Louis, and they weren't coming to St. Louis. So they had to see that somebody in St. Louis.
That's the former Mrs. Emerson?
Right. They had to get somebody in St. Louis where Dred was to do it. So who better to get than the son?
The former owner.
Yeah, former owner's son.
Okay.
And the family who was supporting him all along. Somebody they could trust who would actually free them also. that needs to be said. Not somebody who would just say, I got them now, they're mine.
Yeah.
You know, but somebody they could trust. And Dred actually did suggest that it be Taylor.
Was it just serendipity that Dred Scott was the first to make the case based on once free, always free, or were there concurrent?
No, I'm not even sure he's the first one. No, he's not the first one, no.
But it just was serendipitous that it got to the Supreme Court.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah. Like I said, if Roswell Field hadn't entered the story,
Right.
nothing would have happened. If Dred and Harriett had said, you know, we're really tired, it's been 6 years, how's this going to work? If we couldn't win here, how are we going to win there? They had to make a courageous decision to move forward. And in doing that, that's the time frame somewhere in there toward the last few years where they hid their daughters away so well that no one knows where they were hid to this day. And that was a great sacrifice for them and the little ones.
What was your message to the students at Metro when you were here with the presentation? I mean, did you talk about what we've been talking about?
Yes, I did. I did. You know, the first session we had was just a very short and general overview with questions, and the second was a PowerPoint presentation where I probably shared a few more things even than what we're talking about now. But, you know, ultimately it was the idea that we need to know that this man and his wife were willing to endure 11 years and not say, you know, even after it went to the federal level, there was a point where they could have said, okay, see, so we lost there. You know, yeah, people were wanting to see something happen and that was their best shot. You know, but the courage and tenacity that it took for them to stay in that, because it was very dangerous, you know, very dangerous. People could have just said, why are you pressing this case? You know, I don't want to get away from your question.
No.
But there was a play called No Land's Man, and it was written for the St. Louis Black Rep in 2007 by Bill Harris. It was a lovely touring play, and in that play, it was Dred and Harriett and two other lady slaves, the narrator who was like an archivist. And in that play, one of the young ladies, just another slave lady, was very upset about the fact that this case was going forward. Things are okay. Why are they pushing this? Why is this happening? Why don't they just leave it alone? What's going to happen to us? What's going to happen to me? And so she was typifying those people who were already enslaved but not sure where it would go.
Fear
of the unknown, of what would that verdict be. And as it turns out, their fears were justified. They were now told that they could not be, not now nor ever, and get this, neither could any of their descendants be a citizen. That's me.
Just incredible that the
That's
U.S.
me.
Supreme Court, that came out of the United States
Yeah.
Supreme Court at one
Yeah.
time in this country, isn't it?
It is. And that's why the Dred Scott case is often cited as one of the, if not the worst Supreme Court decision ever rendered. And, you know, we've had a few other pretty rough ones since then, but that one still seems to be the iconic landmark for bad court cases.
You alluded to Dred and your great-great-grandmother having to hide.
No, they hid the girls.
They hid the family, hid the children.
Two girls,
yeah.
yes.
Because they were fearful of their...
Fearful of their lives, fearful
Weren't
of
they
being...
fearful of their own lives?
I'm sure. I'm sure they were.
I mean, do we know what it was like for them during those years?
Not specific day-to-day things, but just the general what
Yeah.
I'm telling you. But the girls were in danger of possibly being sold, because there would have been a way for someone to either find out how to get to Mrs. Emerson or just kidnap them. They could be
Yeah.
walking down the street. There was a lady, and I don't recall her name, but she was noted for buying young girls, because when they got to the age of being likely to meant likely to bear children. And that would make them worth more, and then whoever bought them would be looking for them to have children not far off. But we're talking about, 12, 13, 14-year-old girls.
Wow.
Anticipating them procreating shortly so that your revenues can go up.
Like
And so-
commodities.
Exactly. Well, the whole word was property,
Yep.
property. So it was not a good time, not a good time.
I did or you did it yourself, but we were talking about your message
We're
to
all
the
over the
students,
place.
but
Yeah.
no, that's fine. But
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that we share with our viewers everything that you want to share and that maybe
Yeah.
you shared with the students.
Yeah. Well, again, it was the idea of, you know, just knowing who they were. Wherever I go, I ask people, how many of you know who Dred Scott is? And you'd be amazed that sometimes only 1 or 2 hands go up in the audience. And so it's hard sometimes for me to go into attendant things related to the story because the story itself has to be understood
Absolutely.
first. So that's where the...
Isn't that scary?
Well, it is, you know, but there are many other wonderful stories out there that are just as unknown. And I really like to share this about the movie Lincoln. And I also ask people, how many of you have seen that? Not enough hands go up. Everybody needs to go see the movie Lincoln. Because, you know, when it first came out, it was like, well, oh, it's going to be about Abraham Lincoln. But it's really specifically about how he ended slavery and his team. So that to me is a must-see. But no, it's sad that we're not knowing these people. In that movie, Thaddeus Stevens is somebody that you will remember when you see it. But who was he? And I found him probably, wow, time is sure flying. I only found him in like 2003 or 4. And I was just overwhelmed at who this man was and the things he had accomplished, the things that he did, you know, his role even in the 13th Amendment and all these things. Nobody knows these people. And what I really admire about him is after all of what he's accomplished, he was born with a club foot. And yet it didn't stop him from being who he was, doing what he was commissioned to do. And I just like to tell people, and that was one of my messages is, you know, don't look at any weakness that you have and don't find any excuse not to do what you came here to do. Because this man was amazing.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you one thing about him, and we'll move on. When he died, he insisted on being buried in a cemetery that would allow blacks to be buried with whites. And that just didn't hardly ever happen.
You're talking about
Thaddeus Stevens.
Thaddeus Stevens, yeah.
Yes, and he insisted that he did not want to be buried. You know, and this was a high man in the cabinet of Abraham Lincoln. And he was a big person in the...
I'm trying to remember who played him in the movie.
I see his face.
Yeah.
I just watched it the other day, and I'm looking, oh my goodness.
Yeah, well, that's okay. Go see the movie and you'll see the credits.
It'll come to us before we're done.
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, he's very well known, you know him.
But it is scary that, you know, that young folks especially don't have any clue about all this history.
It's true, and let's not get into curriculum, but that, you know, just wasn't there. And so one of the messages I had was go out and teach yourself. You know, there's no excuse now for you to not know anything. If I say to you, Brer Rabbit, you can go out there and find it right now, you know, and what does that mean? Who is that? If I want us to find a Dr. Seuss story, I can go find that in, you know, 10 seconds. There's no excuse. So I said, go out there and teach yourself and make your own little certificate. And, you know, you don't have to get a degree from college, but you will have the equivalent of a doctorate degree if you dig into something and let it become your passion.
I want to see if we can get the website up here, take a look, because there's some things on there, and I know you've got all kinds of activities that you're really, here's the website here, the dredscottfoundation.org. One of the things we were talking about before we went on the air was the event you had in late February. Want to stop that?
Yeah, can we stop right there? And so I'd be sure to get this in.
Sure.
We haven't talked about the statue yet. And
no.
We shall do that, I'm sure. But please look at our statue campaign, and not only that, the statue itself, which is so beautiful. This is the first ever that was ever built of Dred Scott and his wife by Harry Weber.
And where is it?
In St. Louis, in front of the old courthouse, facing the arch. And it was dedicated in 2012. That was one of our commemorative activities. And
so the foundation got this done?
Yes, we did.
Good for you.
We did, and it was a pretty good chunk of bucks, $250,000. And we just need 35 more for a matching grant to pay it off. So we hope people will hear that.
And there's a way online.
Right there on that page, they can donate on that page or through the mail. But that was one thing. And then the other thing was a penny drive. If you go to the website, you will see a wonderful little video that Clayton and Ladue high schools in St. Louis put together for their penny drive competition, and they let us put it up there, and it really is fabulous. The penny drive is one way that we've helped involve school children and really families, organizations, churches, synagogues, etc.
What is the penny drive?
The penny drive is just that. It's a way for people to help us pay for the statue, If you go to the website, you'll see all the ways to do one. There's a penny manual, there are forms. You can sign up and register for it. It doesn't cost anything to do that. If you want to have a penny drive in your school, your home, your church, you just set a period of time and collections come as they will.
There you go.
There you are. That's it.
Why don't we make it the dollar drive?
You know what, at this stage, it is more about other things than pennies, that's for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, it always was, but you know, again, but let me
Sure.
stop right there. You see the pennies on top of his headstone?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, those are pennies, and that's Dred Scott's head marker right now. But everybody asks, why are they there? And after researching it, it comes back to the original thought is that Lincoln freed the slaves and he's on the penny. So we have a commemorative penny with Dred Scott on it as well.
This is just, you know, we're talking about raising money, not pennies, folks.
That's right. Especially now because we have this matching grant. So whatever anybody would do would double, and we could move on into some more activities.
What do you hope to do if you had the resources?
You know, ultimately, it would be great if we had a Dred Scott Reconciliation Center where we could actually put in there all these wonderful things that have come to light about the history since 2000, and a place to share our stories, our histories, and to have reconciliation events, activities,
great.
workshops. Yeah, and
That'd
you know,
be in St. Louis, I'm sure.
it would have to be in St. Louis. It absolutely would. I have a few things that have not been seen that I would like to have somewhere to put, and until I do, they probably won't for a while.
The first thing is to get the statue paid for.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly, yes, because that's an obligation. And Harry Weber, I wanted to say his name again. He did this beautiful monument for us. He's a lovely gentleman, and he's an exceptional sculptor. So,
Missourian?
yes, he is. He is. And we did a blind evaluation when we, you know, put our bid out for the statue, and he just happened to win because he had the best thing going on. But it's a lovely accomplishment. We're very pleased about that.
You also can see on the website information about the theater troupe and the Reconciliation Forum,
Yes.
which you call Sons and Daughters of Reconciliation.
Correct. Sons and Daughters of
Yeah.
Reconciliation, that's right.
Take a minute here and wrap up your thoughts about your great-great-grandfather and grandmother. I meant to ask about her, and be another show probably. Isn't that terrible? I mean, she's the wife and she gets shortchanged in all the conversation. But
Yeah,
we've only got a
little
minute and a
bit.
half. What?
A minute and a half. Okay,
Yeah.
well, let me tell you a little bit about her.
Oh, no.
Just one thing.
All right.
She has her own headstone. That Dred was found, his grave was found at the 100th anniversary, and hers was found at the 150th. And now they both have headstones.
Great.
So that's fabulous.
It is.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm just proud of them. I'm very privileged and proud to represent them and represent our family. It is something that I believe that it was given from God to do, and I would just like people to not only learn my story because it affects us all, but I encourage people to dig into their own family histories
bet.
because it's fascinating what you find. We found out that babies are buried with them that we didn't even know about.
This has been fun. I appreciate it very much. Been very
Thank you.
informative, and we appreciate you being on the show.
It was a
And
pleasure.
being at the college.
I've enjoyed Omaha very much.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you.
Lynn M. Jackson, the founder and president of the Dred Scott Heritage Foundation. Thank you. And thank you for being with us again on Metro and More. Our goal is to better acquaint you of the mission, reach, and the leadership of the college. I'm Kent Pavelka from Metropolitan Community College.
This has been a Metrovision production produced by Metropolitan Community College.
After high school, I became a father and had to put college on hold. I never had a chance to do what I really wanted. Now at 35, I'm moving forward with a career in media arts. MCC makes it convenient and comfortable, plus the facilities are outstanding. They were very accepting of me coming back.
On average, every hour of credit increases the income of an MCC student by $159 per year. The inspiring option is Metropolitan Community College.